Thank you, everybody, for joining the Bridgeport Public Library. We're excited to have author Harold Schechter here to talk about his new book, Butcher's Work, True Crime Tales of American Murder and Madness. Harold Schechter is a professor I'm sorry, you said professor emeritus last time, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. American literature and culture. Renowned for his true crime writing, he is the author of the nonfiction books Fatal, Fiend, Bestial, Deviant, Deranged, Depraved, and with David Everett, the A to Z Encyclopedia of Serial Killers. He's also the author of Nevermore and The Humbug, the acclaimed historical novels featuring Edgar Allan Poe. We'll get to his presentation.
Oh, well, thank you all for coming to this. So, this is my newest book, Butcher's Work, which is a collection of 4 true crime narratives. I'll just tell you about uh, why I wrote it, what the kind of rationale behind the book is. So, I've written many true crime books. And one thing that's always fascinated me is why, well, one thing that's always depressed me actually is in doing my research, I've discovered that not a day goes by where some horrific crime isn't committed in the United States. And this has always been true. Um, and what's always interested, and some of them become sometimes nationwide sensations. They're called the crime of the century and so on. But 99.9% of them quickly fade from public memory, and really only an infinitesimal number of them uh, become part of, this immortal part of our cultural lore. To give you an example, in the introduction to Butcher's Work, talk about this case in 1927 where this guy, Edward Hickman, abducted the young daughter of a bank president who was a bank he used to work at and demanded this ransom. He held this young girl captive. He treated her quite well, actually. When she got bored, he would take her out on drives. He would buy her ice cream. He even took her to the movies once. And finally, when the father agreed to pay the ransom, they made these arrangements where Hickman was going to arrive by car at this rendezvous spot with the little girl. Her name was Marion Parker, and meet the father who would have the money. The father would hand over the money, and Hickman would hand over his daughter. So the two arrived as planned, and the father could see sitting in the passenger seat his daughter. He handed over the money. Hickman reached over, opened the passenger door, threw the daughter out, and zoomed away. Father ran over and discovered, to his unspeakable horror, that what he now held in his hands was the dismembered and disemboweled torso of his daughter, whose eyelids had been sewn open to make it seem as if she were alive. Anyway, when Hickman was arrested, he kept boasting that he was going to be more famous than Leopold and Loeb, which is not an unreasonable expectation, since in many respects his crime was far ghastlier than the kidnap murder that Leopold and Loeb had committed. But as it turns out, Hickman has been totally forgotten, except by scholars of American crime, whereas Leopold and Loeb have really entered into our cultural mythology and have been the subjects of movies, including Alfred Hitchcock's Rope and a very good movie called Compulsion. Books continue to be written about them. So another case happened in Connecticut in 2007. I'm sure some of you remember, where there was this horrible home invasion in Cheshire, Connecticut, where these two ex-convicts invaded the home of a doctor and beat him and left him in the basement, and then tortured and raped his wife and kids, and then made the wife the next morning go to the ATM and withdraw the money, and then they killed her. And set the house on fire, and this incredibly awful crime that was covered extensively in the national news. And yet, if you ask who committed those crimes, I mean, even if you ask me who committed those crimes, I would have to look it up. So I've always been interested again in why it is that certain crimes, as I said, become an undying part of our cultural mythology, whereas others, equally, if not more heinous, just fade from public memory very quickly. So I've been trying to resurrect some of those latter crimes, crimes that at the time were national, and again, at the time, even international sensations, and were often called the crime of the century, but again, faded into obscurity pretty quickly. So Butcher's work is a collection of 4 narratives about these crimes. So the first one that I deal with, the title of the chapter is called Butcher's Work. It has to do with, whoops, see if this works. This young man whose name was Anton Probst. And Probst became committed what I have come to regard as the most ghastly mass murder of the late 19th century in America. So Probst was a German immigrant who arrived in New York in 1863. The minute he got off the boat, he was recruited into the Union Army. The Army would set up these recruitment tables outside of the landing place. It wasn't Ellis Island at that time. It was a place called Castle Garden. And as soon as a likely looking young man stepped off the boat, they would try to get him enlisted in the Army with the inducement of a $300 bonus. Probst was a person whose basically only interests in life were the satisfaction of his appetites, mostly for liquor and prostitutes. So he immediately signed up, and he became what was called at the time a bounty jumper. These were men who would sign up for one regiment, serve for a while, desert, sign up for another regiment, collect a bounty, do the same thing. Some of them actually ended up making a lot of money that way. The government ultimately considered a federal crime and would execute some of these people when they were caught. That did not happen to Probst. He contrived to be discharged by shooting off the thumb, I think, of his left hand. Although the Civil War came to an end very shortly thereafter, he could have saved himself the mutilation, but he didn't. Anyway, he wandered around for a while, working various odd jobs, and then somehow came to the farm of a guy named Deering. This is an engraving of the Deering farm, which was located in a part outside in Pennsylvania, outside Philadelphia, a rural area known as the Neck. So Deering, was a very hard-working Irish immigrant with a wife and 4 children, who also, besides farming, ran this cattle raising business, which was partly subsidized by a partner who lived in Philadelphia. Anyway, Probst showed up at his doorstep one day, begging for work, and Deering, who is a charitable and kind-hearted man, took him in as a farmhand for a salary, as I remember, of $15 a month with room and board. Deering's wife developed this immediate aversion to Probst. She just felt, correctly as it turned out, there was something creepy about him. But Deering kept him on. But Probst was not a person who was much given to hard work. And he began to resent the demands that Deering was making on him. One day Deering sent him out to do some farm work in the rain, and Probst refused to do it, and Deering fired him. Probst wandered around for a while, doing various odd jobs, and then when he found himself completely destitute, he showed up at Deering's farm again and begged to be rehired, which Deering did, although at a smaller salary, I think $10 a month. Probst, however, had not come back simply to be rehired. He had come to believe that Deering always kept large amounts of cash in his home. And it was true that Deering did sometimes have large amounts of cash, which he had gotten from his wealthy partner to use to buy livestock. But in general, he had very little money around. Anyway, and by the way, you'll have to forgive me sometimes, because once I write a book, I tend to forget all the details. But anyway, one day, I can't remember the exact date, in 1866, Deering went off to make a weekly trip into Philadelphia to stock up on provisions, to meet with his business partner, and on this particular day, to pick up a relative, a woman, a cousin, who was coming for a family visit. While Deering was gone, I should have mentioned there was one other farmhand who worked for Deering, and who actually shared a bed with Probst. This was not uncommon in those days. A guy named young man named Cornelius Carey. While Deering was gone, Probst murdered Cornelius Carey. He killed him with an axe and shoved his body into a haystack. Then he went to the farmhouse and he called Mrs. Deering, and he told her that one of the calves in the barn, something was wrong with it. And she went into the barn to look. Probst came up behind her, killed her with an axe, and dragged her into the barn. Then he systematically called each child in turn into the barn, saying their mother was looking for them, and killed each of them in turn. This is an engraving from an old true crime pamphlet of the time. Fascination with true crime stories is nothing new. In fact, it goes back pretty much to the invention of the printing press. And whenever there was a very sensational crime, these hack writers and publishers would turn out these crime pamphlets, sometimes luridly illustrated. This actually shows him stabbing Cornelius Carey by the haystack, though he used an axe. Let me just see here. Oh. So here, Probst is, as the caption says, dispatching Mrs. Deering. And again, he just ended up systematically killing all the kids, including this infant who he picked up and just bashed the brains out of. And he hid all of them in the barn and covered them with hay. So this is him concealing his bloody work. He put them all in this haystack. I guess actually I misspoke. There were 5 children. Probst killed 4 of them, one after another. There was a little boy who, fortunately for him, was off visiting his grandfather, so he escaped this terrible fate. Then, excuse me here. Here's another image, slightly more sophisticated, of Probst dragging the corpses into the barn. Then when Deering arrived, Um, Probst lured him into the barn, killed him, and he killed this female cousin who had come from a visit. So he committed this incredible mass slaughter um, of these totally not only innocent people, but people who had treated him very, very kindly. And then he ransacked the house and, of course, did not find any money. Some neighbors, a couple of days later, discovered that the animals had been unattended. They just noticed this weird situation on the farm. They came to explore. They discovered this mass slaughter. And Deering, of course, and Probst, of course, became the primary suspect. People thought, after committing such an atrocity, he would put as much distance between himself and the crime scene as he could, maybe even return to Germany. But Probst, being Probst, basically couldn't think beyond his next dream and prostitute. So he had just gone back to a shady area of Philadelphia, holed up in a tavern, drank, again, hired women. And he was, this is a engraving I have of the police turning up the horrific evidence. Carey's body wasn't found until a few days later. Actually, Cornelius Carey, the young farmhand he had shoved into the haystack. Like other crime scenes, the Probst farm attracted thousands of morbid sightseers as soon as the crimes were discovered. And some of the sightseers, were around this haystack and were, kind of posing in front of it with their friends. If they'd had iPhones, they would have been taking selfies. And one of them noticed his foot sticking out of the haystack. And that's when Cornelius Carey's corpse was discovered. Anyway, Probst was arrested in short order. This is an illustration of that. Some policemen kind of recognized, there were lots of descriptions of him. Neighbors, had seen him often, so they were able to offer a description of Probst. And some sharp-eyed policemen noticed him skulking across a bridge and arrested him. And this is an image of the bodies of the Deering family laid out for public view. So, Probst again became this criminal celebrity. True crime books of the time, these pamphlets were immediately rushed out. He was tried. It's a picture of him in the dock. This is a picture of the only one of the Deering family's little Willie, as he was called in the press, who survived and who offered very damning testimony against Probst. Probst had been carrying around, he had stolen Deering's watch and some other items, some of which he hawked. And Willie at the trial was able to identify them as his father's. And Deering was hanged. For a long time, he claimed innocence. He tried, as other killers have done, to put the blame on an accomplice. But, that story fell through. And before his hanging, he finally confessed. He was hanged. Then, back in those days, there were restrictions put on the kind of cadavers that medical schools could have access to. And primarily, they had access to the bodies of executed criminals. So, like other murderers of the time, Probst was dissected. This is just a photograph of a dissection of the time. Probst was dissected actually in front of quite a large audience of medical students and just curiosity seekers. But then somehow, and nobody knows exactly how, but in those days there were these what they were called dime museums, which were presented themselves as educational institutions, but they were just very kind of sordid collections of all kinds of medical anomalies and freaks and creepy stuff, and also things having to do with sex. They would have displays of genitalia and so on. They were a little bit, one of their functions was kind of not unlike 20th century Times Square peep shows. Somehow Probst's head and right arm was acquired by the New York Museum of Anatomy, which was one of the premier institutions of its kind. And again, exactly how the museum got hold of it has not been totally documented, but it was apparently the actual sort of mummified head and right arm of Probst. So that was the story of Anton Probst. Again, it's incredibly sensational crime, nationwide newspaper coverage, obviously well known enough that the mere advertisement of his head and right arm could draw crowds to this museum, and yet basically totally forgotten. Another case that I wrote about, the second case I wrote about, was this woman, Lydia Sherman. I became very interested a number of years ago in the phenomenon of female serial murder, because when I first began writing, I consider myself a true crime historian. And when I should say, by the way, that for 42 years, I was a professor of American literature at Queens College, City University of New York. And at some point, I became, although it wasn't the career path I had foreseen for myself, a true crime historian. And I became interested in the whole phenomenon of female serial murder, because when I was first writing true crime, the received wisdom was that there was no such thing as a female serial killer. People would say, like, Aileen Wuornos was the first serial killer, female serial killer. And my research told me otherwise. What I came to believe was that there's a culture critic, Camille Paglia, who said there are no female Jack the Rippers, and that's correct, which is to say there are no female sexual mutilation murderers of the Jack the Ripper type. That seems to be a very male, gender-specific form of serial killing. But it doesn't mean there aren't female serial killers, it just means they commit their crimes in different ways from men. Back in the 19th century, most of them tended to use poison. And another difference between female serial killers and male serial killers is male serial killers tend to prey on strangers, whereas female serial killers tend to prey on intimates, family members, close friends, and so on. I always felt that women could not claim their full equality with men until they could admit their capacity for sadistic serial murder. And, kind of quaint Victorian atmosphere, aura, has come to surround these women poisoners, I think largely because of the popularity of the movie Arsenic and Old Lace, which I assume many of you have seen, which actually was based on a true crime that happened in Connecticut. But what I came to realize is that in many ways, these female serial killers are far more sadistic than, say, Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper killed his victims very swiftly. He would basically cut their throats. All the atrocities he perpetrated were done on their dead bodies. All the mutilations were done post-mortem. Whereas female serial killers subject their victims to days and weeks, sometimes more, this terrible agony by slowly administering poison to them and, watching them suffer, and then finally, delivering a fatal dose. And again, what makes it even more horrific is their victims are often their children or siblings, people they're very, very closely attached to. Lydia Sherman, for example, was responsible for murdering 3 husbands and 6 of her own children. So, her story was she got married at a very young age to a guy named Edward Struck. He subsequently became a policeman in New York City, who was then fired in disgrace. And he sank into what we would now call a clinical depression. And she got tired of caring for him, so she poisoned him. Back then, it was very, very easy for anyone to get their hands on arsenic. You could just go to any drugstore and buy enough arsenic, to kill 50 people. You would tell them you had rats in the house. And there were other sources. I mean, you could just go to a general store and buy rough on rats, rat poison. And one thing I've learned from my research is that we should all be very grateful we live today in terms of the advances in medical care since the late 19th century. Medicine was so primitive then that all these doctors, would come and see these formerly healthy people who had suddenly were afflicted with these very severe intestinal problems and diagnose it as whatever, nephritis or diphtheria or whatever. I mean, even medicines at that time often contained poisons. I mean, arsenic was a component of some medications. If you read the Merck manual from back then, it's like, if your kid has a whooping cough, give him a teaspoonful of formaldehyde and so on. Anyway, so she poisoned her husband. He was no longer a burden. But then she was left as a single mother with a number of kids. And as long as the older kids, she immediately dispatched the younger ones when she got tired of taking care of them. She had a couple of older children, and as long as they had jobs and were able to bring in some money, they were okay. But as soon as they fell ill or for one reason or another couldn't work, she poisoned them as well. So this is actually a later murder. This is a little out of chronological order, but it gives you an idea. Again, this is from one of these 19th century pamphlets. I mean, the story with Lydia is one of the ironic things about Lydia was that the doctors, of course, like other spouses who poisoned their family, she deflected suspicion by seeming to be to really minister to her dying family members with a great deal of care and attention. And she was always careful to mix up their medicines for them and make sure they drank them. And one of the doctors was so impressed with her that he actually got her a job at a hospital. So one of America's most prolific serial killers became a healthcare worker. But then she married another guy named Hurlburt. Their marriage lasted, he was older than she was. Their marriage lasted until he had some kind of accident on the farm and took to his bed, and she got tired of taking care of him and murdered him. Then she got married to her last husband, a guy named Sherman, who was an alcoholic, who was always squandering her money. She had collected a significant amount of money on insurance. Many of these female serial poisoners have a mercenary motive, but the mercenary motive isn't really sufficient to explain their criminality, because some of them actually, Lydia, by the time she killed her second husband, was pretty well off. She'd inherited property, she inherited insurance money. She just liked to kill her family members. She derived some sadistic pleasure from it. She killed Sherman. She killed her two stepchildren. Finally, what happened, happens to many of these, female serial poisoners, is people finally become suspicious that everyone around them seems to die of these mysterious intestinal ailments in great agony, and they end up collecting money upon their deaths. So she was arrested, tried, convicted, sent to prison. She actually escaped at one time, but was promptly rearrested. And again, her last murder was in Connecticut. Here's a newspaper clipping from the time. She was known as, well, one of the things they called her was the American Lucretia Borgia. So here's a true crime pamphlet about her. I guess I misspoke. I don't know if I said 8 of her children or 6, but anyway, 8 of her kids. Here's another true crime pamphlet, The Poison Fiend. Again, printers would rush out these books. So Lydia's story is the second part of my book. That one is called The Poison Fiend. The third narrative in my book, which is called Lady Killer, has to do with this gentleman. Again, a guy whose crimes made international headlines. He went by many names, but the name that has gone down in criminal history is Johann Hock, which was not his original name was Jakob Schmidt, but he was a German immigrant. He was of the category of serial killer as kind of the male counterpart to people like Lydia Sherman. Lydia Sherman, those kinds of serial killers are sometimes called Black Widows for obvious reasons. Hock was arguably the most prolific American, what are called Bluebeard murderers. The term comes, as I'm sure many of you know, from the famous folktale by Charles Perrault, where it appeared in his classic collection, Tales of Mother Goose, about a creepy aristocrat with a blue beard who marries and murders a succession of wives. He brings them to his castle, gives them the keys to every room, tells them he's going on a trip, tells them they can go into any room except one forbidden room. And of course, as soon as he's gone, they enter it and discover the dismembered bodies of all his previous wives. And they end up hung on the walls themselves. So yeah, Hock was this very prolific Bluebeard killer. Nobody really knows how many women he killed, but his MO, here he is at trial, not a particularly prepossessing individual, but he preyed on wealthy German widows throughout the country. He was really a peripatetic serial killer. And he would present himself as this very respectable, wealthy, sometimes aristocratic individual who, had a seductive way about him and would woo and win the hearts of these susceptible middle-aged German widows, telling them that, they would have a man to take care of them. Some of them actually were not terribly wealthy. There were some of them who were working in little shops and so on. So he promised them a life of greater ease. because he was, again, supposedly wealthy. He would come into a neighborhood, rent a nice house, and then meet this woman, often through matrimonial agencies or putting advertisements in German language newspapers. He would take them, show them this beautiful house. He would fill it with furniture that he bought on credit, and then he would never pay for it. Impress them with what comfortable lives they would lead. I mean, most of them agreed to marry him sometimes within days of meeting him. And then, as soon as they were wed, he would have them sign over their property to him. And very often he would simply make off with their money. He might tell them, for example, that he wanted to take them to Germany on their honeymoon to show them his family estate, but he needed $300 for the tickets. So the woman would hand over the money. Hawk would then disappear, and they would never see him again. But in at least a dozen cases, he ended up murdering these women. This is a newspaper engraving of some of his victims of the time. Nobody knows for sure how many victims he killed. Nobody knows for sure how many women he married and managed to embezzle out of their money. Estimates range up to 50. And considering how swiftly he operated, it's not unlikely. Anyway, again, as so often happens, when he married this one woman in West Virginia, who was, very, very healthy, but who instantly became sick and then died, it aroused a good deal of suspicion, particularly in the woman's minister, who became very, very suspicious of Hawk. And Hawk was aware of this, and he staged his own suicide and then made off. But the minister became convinced that Hawk had not committed suicide. He had supposedly drowned himself in a river. But not only was no body ever found, but there were people who knew him who had spotted him shortly afterwards getting on a train to Chicago. So it was largely through the unrelenting efforts of this minister, who kept searching the newspapers around the country for stories about, a potential Bluebeard killer, that Hawk was finally arrested. He was arrested in New York City. What was interesting is, I'm sure many of you know the story of H.H. Holmes of Chicago. Newspapers reported that Hawk had been an associate of Holmes. Holmes was also a kind of Bluebeard killer, but it turned out there was really no connection. It was just one of the, back then, the sensationalistic yellow press, Hearst's newspapers, Pulitzer's papers, would just publish these stories in order to sell papers, which had no relationship to the truth. The old cliche, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So there were all these sensational claims that turned out not to be true. But this is typical of Hearst papers. They would concoct the stories, how I married, it's a little of 50 wives, and then pretend that it was actually written by Hawk, by the killer, which it wasn't. But they would sometimes give the killer, money. I mean, Holmes, for example, was given $5,000 for his supposed confessions, which were written by some hack. Anyway, here's a mugshot when he was arrested. And then he actually kind of reveled in his celebrity after he was arrested, and he felt sure that somehow he would not pay the price, but he did. So that's the third of the four stories. And the last, which I, for some reason, have particular fondness for, again, a story that was one of the big headline stories of its time being the Jazz Age, America. This is Chicago. This is a guy named Carl Wanderer. Now, Wanderer was a World War I veteran, decorated World War I veteran, who came back from overseas and married this, very pretty young woman who immediately got pregnant. And she was around 8 months pregnant. It's a little, sometimes newspapers of the time offer slightly different details. So, some say she was 8 months pregnant, some say she was 9 months pregnant. But anyway, she was due in a very short time. And here's another picture of them. Seemingly very happy couple. These are all photographs of them. Another photograph of them. Anyway, Wanderer went to work at his father's butcher shop. And on his way home one night, well, I forget the exact date, but you could look it up in my book or on Wikipedia. He was walking through this neighborhood in Chicago, and he chanced upon a homeless guy whose name has never, ever been definitively established. And he asked this homeless guy if he wanted to make, I forget what it was, $20 or something. And, the guy leapt at the chance. And he said, okay, my wife and I are going to a movie tonight. When we come out of the movie, we're going to walk by this corner. And what I want you to do is follow us home. And when we get to our house and enter the entranceway, I want you to pretend you're going to rob us. So, this guy said, okay, whatever. He really needed the money. So that night, Wanderer took his wife to see this movie at a local theater. It was a first film version of Jack London's The Sea Wolf with Wallace Beery. She started feeling a little unwell, so they left the movie early. Wanderer took her by the route and passed by this homeless guy. And the homeless guy, by the way, would only be known in the newspapers and forever thereafter. It's even on his tombstone as the Ragged Stranger, because, well, he was homeless and wearing very raggedy clothing. So this guy, the Ragged Stranger, followed Wanderer and his wife home. They went into the entranceway, turned on the little light, and as soon as they did, the Ragged Stranger said, "Don't turn on the light, this is a holdup." Now, according to Wanderer's story, this guy, the Ragged Stranger, was armed with a gun, which he pointed at him and his pregnant wife. According to his story, Wanderer pulled out his own military pistol, which he had begun to carry because his father's butcher shop had been robbed sometime previously, and shot it out with the Ragged Stranger. And in the course of the shootout, the Ragged Stranger shot Wanderer's wife, who died shortly thereafter. And Wanderer shot the Ragged Stranger, who also died shortly thereafter. So this was a story. And the newspaper covered it, as Wanderer was his hero. this vagrant had tried to hold them up uh, in trying to protect his wife. Wander had pulled a gun. Uh, the vagrant had shot and killed the wife, and the hero had then shot and killed the ragged stranger. Immediately, however, people became very suspicious of the story for a variety of reasons. Some had to do with the way the bullets had, when they started to do what at that time was a fairly sophisticated forensic analysis. A lot of what Wanderer claimed didn't hold up. Wanderer also seemed remarkably unfazed by the murder of his wife. He was visited the next day by Ben Hecht. Hecht would later go on to be one of the most celebrated Hollywood screenwriters, but at the time he was working as a Chicago journalist. Hecht went to see him the day after the killings and, was struck by Wanderer's affect. He just seemed whistling and happy and cheery. So an investigation was made, and it was ultimately discovered that the gun found in the ragged stranger's hand had actually, they managed to trace it and discovered that it had belonged to one of Wanderer's cousins, who then testified that Wanderer had borrowed it from him the night before this happened. Anyway, it turned out that the newspaper headlines the other thing that immediately changed. Turned out Wanderer had contrived this whole thing. He actually had two guns with him. The ragged stranger didn't have a gun at all. When the guy entered the lobby and said, "This is, don't turn on the light," Wanderer pulled both guns, shot his wife, shot the ragged stranger, planted the gun in the ragged stranger's hand. The whole thing was a way of getting rid of his wife. And subsequently was discovered that Wanderer was conducting a romance with his very, very pretty neighbor. These are some photographs of her. So anyway, Wanderer eventually confessed. This is a picture of him signing the confession. He was actually tried twice. His first trial, he was found guilty, but was given a life sentence. And the citizenry of Chicago was so outraged that he hadn't been given the death penalty. They clamored that he be tried again, which he could be, because the first trial was for the murder of his wife. Second trial was for the murder of the ragged stranger. He was eventually convicted, sentenced to death, and famously, when he was on the gallows with a noose around his neck, he started singing this popular song of the time, "My Gal Sal." Ben Hecht was there with his colleague Charles MacArthur, who also became a very famous Hollywood screenwriter. And after Wander was hanged, MacArthur turned to Hecht and said, "That son of a bitch should have been a song plugger." So anyway, so those are the four stories that make up my book. And I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Yeah, if you have any questions, you could put them in the chat.
No?
See any at the moment.
Ask two on you. No. All right. Well,
Um, oh, okay, I got a couple of questions popping up. Patricia asks, is your book in stores? Yeah, it's been released.
yes. It was published in November. Obviously available on Amazon. Um, if you read books on Kindle, I almost kind of recommend that because somehow the print is kind of small in the book, but your eyesight might be better than mine. But yeah, it's available in stores, on Amazon, also in Kindle form.
Uh, and then Matt asks, when you're looking to interview people for a project, what's your best way to go about that?
Well, I mean, generally, when I write certain books, when I've written many books, I've often hired a genealogical record searcher to help me find sometimes descendants of the criminals, descendants of the relatives of the victims. In the old days, I would call them up, out of the blue, tell them who I was and what I was doing. I've usually, gotten really, really useful replies. I mean, in one case, uh, there was a guy who was really the family historian who invited me down to his home and had this incredible archive of material that he let me bring back with me. So yeah, I mean, I just used to call them. Now, of course, if I can track them down by email, I'll get in touch with them. Um, so yes, again, most of the books I've written have dealt with crimes, from the past. Sometimes there are no people to interview, but the first book I wrote, first true crime book, was a book called Deviant, which is about Edward Gein, very notorious figure, who inspired the movies Psycho and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the character of Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. In that case, I went to his hometown, Plainfield, Wisconsin, interviewed people. His crimes were committed in the 50s, interviewed people who knew him very well. So, yeah, I mean, again, in the past, I would reach out to people by telephone, really. Now I'll do it via the internet.
Pat asked, what prompted you to choose these individuals to profile?
Well, I mean, I knew all about their cases. Years ago, I had written a book called Psycho USA, Famous American Murderers You Never Heard of, or something like that. Again, prompted by my interest in these once sensational crimes that had faded into obscurity. So except for the Wanderer, well, the Probst, I covered in that book the Probst case and the Lydia Sherman case, but that book just covered those cases much more superficially, because I covered a lot of them. I mean, not so much superficially as just in less detail. So I've always been interested in going back to those cases and writing about them, doing more research. In fact, I thought about writing a whole book about Probst, but then decided there just wasn't enough available material to justify an entire book. Same thing with Lydia Sherman. Um, the other cases, well, I think I wrote about Hawk also. I definitely did write about Hawk in one of my other books. So I can't remember how I first came on the Wanderer case. I think I first came on the Wanderer case, funnily enough, back in the 40s and 50s. There used to be these really gruesome horror comics and crime comics, which were eventually put out of business when there was this 1950s crusade against violent comic books. I think actually it was in this one very lurid comic book called Crime Does Not Pay that I came across the Wanderer story. and decided to look into that. So I mean, these were all stories that I knew about and had some interest in, and decided to research in more detail.
Patrick asks, why is it such an English-speaking world phenomenon?
Why is what?
I believe, I mean that, I think he's referring to serial killing, I believe.
Why is interest in it? Hello?
He says yes. I think he says yes for serial killing. Yeah.
Well, let me
Yeah.
just say, people think that somehow our fascination with, you know, serial murders and all kinds of lurid crimes and so on is, some hallmark of contemporary degeneracy or something. It's important to realize human beings, I have my own theories about why this is, have always been fascinated by horrific crimes. I mean, you can obviously see that in the great literature of the world. Uh, Shakespeare's plays or Titus Andronicus, filled with, all kinds of atrocities. But people have always been interested in sensational crimes. Before mass literacy in Europe, whenever a horrible crime was committed, it would be turned into an oral ballad. And then, literally as soon as the Gutenberg press was invented, true crime books, I mean, not exactly of the kind we're used to, they would often have some religious or supposedly educational, purpose, were printed. Um, there's a book, God's Revenge. I can't remember, I can never remember the exact title, but it was something about God's revenge against the heinous and whatever crime of murder, which is a collection of true crime stories. Again, with this moralistic ending, basically crime does not pay. That was this enormously popular book in Shakespeare's day, and even into the 19th century, was one of Nathaniel Hawthorne's favorite pieces of reading matter. His son reported that Hawthorne basically dipped into it almost every night. He read it so avidly that he destroyed the binding of the book. One of the first, if not the first books to come off the printing press in America was a true crime book. The Pilgrims, the Puritans, the New England Puritans, when a crime was committed, and a capital crime was committed, and the person was sent to the gallows, they would always publish, these uh, sermons, which describe the crime and the repentance of the criminal on the gallows. So there's nothing new about that. I mean, the fact of the matter is, all of us God-fearing, law-abiding people who would never commit a horrible deed. There's a part of us, the philosopher William James called the carnivore within. We evolved from a very violent species, and we need some vicarious outlet for our own forbidden fantasies. And true crime, not only true crime, I mean, most of, pop culture, provides that. So specifically in terms of serial killers, I actually think the interest in serial killers has faded a bit. The obsession with serial killers was a function of or a product of the 70s and 80s. I think it had to do with that time with, again, the social revolution and the unleashing of the American id. Nowadays, our obsessions have shifted to the mass murder, obviously. There are still serial killers, although there don't seem to be any of the type of a Jeffrey Dahmer or John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy, but there's still serial murders. But, now we're obsessed with mass murderers. So, the kinds of crimes that a culture becomes obsessed with are always changing.
And Jennifer asks, are any of Probst's remains still stored or displayed anywhere?
No, not to my knowledge. I have no idea what became of his head and right arm. So yes, no, not to my knowledge.
Okay. So I don't see any more questions. So thank you very much to Harold Schechter for this great presentation. Please check our social media for upcoming events, including February 9th at the Black Rock Library, Black History in Connecticut, artifacts from the Connecticut Historical Society. And thanks again to everybody for joining. Thank you to Harold. Please check out his new book. And everybody have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.